Today on Inside the Issues, Jason Blackstock on global climate politics. Welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues. I'm David Welch, the CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at Waterloo, Ontario. Every week we talk to a noted expert on some important issue in global governance. Here with us in the studio at the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario. This week I'm very pleased to welcome Jason Blackstock, who is a Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment here at the Centre for International Governance Innovation. And Jason is also a visiting research scholar at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
You've been leading the CG program essentially on global climate governance. Last week we had a chat here in the studio with Tad Homer-Dixon. So we've already had a little bit of a discussion about climate change. Tad is pessimistic about the prospects of humanity wrestling the problem of climate change to the ground, not entirely pessimistic. But we talked a good deal about the science of the problem of climate change, and today I'd like to chat with you a bit more about the politics of it. So let's begin with the general question of why is the politics of global climate change today such a mess? Why are we in such a bad state after more than 20 years of generally recognized understanding that this is a problem that humanity really has to address?
Yes, well, David, Tad has some very good reasons for being pessimistic. As you point out, and as I'm sure he pointed out last week, the science has been well known for quite a bit of time. As you point out, 20 years, some of the data goes back even further than that, demonstrating that we've got a problem. But our ability to get together as a global community and begin tangibly addressing the source of the problem, particularly emissions of greenhouse gases, which are causing the warming, has been pretty abysmal so far. And there's a number of reasons for that, a number of things that play into it. One of which, the first of which, is just the sheer complexity of the problem and the range of things that are involved. The fact that this does impact every aspect, the way we use energy, carbon, I'm sure Tad talked about this, impacts every aspect of our lives, from jobs to food security to energy to our transportation. But because of that, when we get together to negotiate about how we're going to solve this problem, when the international community gets together to discuss these issues, everything's on the table. And as all of these issues are playing in the background, and when you've got nearly 200 countries with all of those different interest groups from those countries coming to the table together, it can sound a lot like a cacophony. And trying to sort out that cacophony and what the real issues are can be very challenging.
This is a classic collective action problem, isn't it? Everybody who's negotiating has a short-term mandate not to harm the short-term interests of their countries
Precisely.
And their economies.
Yeah.
And nobody can actually afford, in a competitive environment, to shoulder a disproportionate share of the burden of adjustment.
Well, that's the question of how you do afford that. There's lots of questions remaining about what that burden will actually be, how much it will cost different players in the game, and then how you go about making the transition and absorbing those costs in a fair and equitable way. Now, this leads into some of the underlying issues that have been playing out in the global negotiations so much for the last 2 decades. And it actually, again, goes back further than that. One of the main ones is actually the issues of trust and legitimacy in the North-South divide, or the divide between countries that are already developed and have been emitting greenhouse gases for almost a century in high levels, and those countries that are still in the development pathway, some of which are emerging economies like China and India, some of which are still dealing with basic development issues, such as in Africa. And one of the things that the climate negotiations have tried to address is what needs to be done by these different communities. But whereas developed countries sit back and say we have to share the burden equitably, which means you developing countries need to set targets for the future, developing countries sit back and go, well, hang on, who put the carbon there in the first place? Who created this problem? You guys need to go first. And we've had some historic commitments by developed countries. The Kyoto Protocol, which came about in the late 90s, is a perfect example. It was part of the last 20 years of climate negotiations. And a lot of developed countries committed to reducing their carbon with the idea that they recognized they needed to go first. performance in the last decade, since the Kyoto Agreement started coming into effect, has actually been quite abysmal. Most developed countries, Canada included, missed its targets, either didn't fully commit to the protocol in the end or missed its targets in the end. And as a result, developing countries sit there going, well, hang on, you didn't live up to your commitments, you're still emitting the carbon, why should we go now? But developed countries, in particular in the United States, have been pointing at places like China, very quickly up-and-coming economies. They've now surpassed the US in terms of total carbon emissions. But keep in mind, per capita, since there's so many more Chinese, that's a lot smaller per capita. But because China's up and coming, the US comes back with the competitive domestic issues of if we put on carbon restrictions and they don't, that's going to be a big problem. It could impact our economy, the issues that we most care about.
So very quickly, just walk us through the history from where we started to where we are now for people who haven't followed this closely.
Okay, so the problem really began coming to a level of scientific consensus that warranted political response in the late 80s and early 90s. That's when the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was formed, the big science body we know a lot about. And that's also led to the formation of the UNCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Basically, that was the UN negotiating process, the global negotiating framework. Now, they didn't agree to cut carbon at that time. They agreed to talk about cutting carbon, thus a negotiating framework. And they spent 5 years talking about committing the first time, and they got to Kyoto in the late 90s, and they agreed to some extent. A lot of countries put forward commitments saying we're going to reduce our carbon by X amount by the year 2012. There was a commitment period which would start late in the next decade and run for about 5 years, in which people would demonstrably ramp down their carbon emissions. Then there was the period late 90s and in the early 2000s where domestically, countries, some of them, in particular important ones like the US, chose not to ratify the treaty. In other words, they signed it and said, yeah, we're going to do this, but actually maybe we're not going to do this. And the results proved as we approached the later half of the last decade that actually some key countries such as the US, again Canada, didn't live up to their commitments. Others did. Europe did pretty well in this, but overall, there was a lot of mistrust that was built into that. That led us to the Bali Action Plan in 2006, and then the Copenhagen climate negotiations a couple years later, where there was a lot of expectation that this time we're going to get a big deal. We need to get the global climate deal where people commit. Unfortunately, Copenhagen was a big letdown. People went in with very high expectations and came out very disappointed by the fact that there just wasn't a commitment, which led us into this last year, and now there's a lot of questions about where to go next with the global climate problem.
Well, let's chat about that next when we come back. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Jason, you mentioned that Copenhagen was a disappointment because of unmet high expectations. And since then, there's been another international meeting in Cancun, which was greeted more positively than Copenhagen. Was that reaction justified in your view? Was something actually accomplished in Cancun?
Cancun was perceived more positively for a couple of reasons. First, because of how let down people were after Copenhagen, the expectations that anything was going to come from the global negotiations were pretty low for all the reasons I'd mentioned before, the cacophony of issues, how do you sort that out? Which took a lot of pressure off, which meant that world leaders weren't so engaged in going. We didn't have presidents and prime ministers showing up in Cancun. You had people from the governments that knew the issues very well and understood where some of the more technical roadblocks were. And so they got down to work looking not at how do we get the total global deal at this meeting, but how do we lay some of the foundations? How do we figure out what the details of the structure of a final deal would have to look like? How do we deal with small issues like the deforestation, not small issues, big issues in the global context, but still, compared to the negotiations, it's technical issues. And they did pretty well on laying some of the foundations for the future. So there is reason for optimism. It shows that there were a lot of lessons learned from Copenhagen. One, don't try and deal with everything in one big go. Pace it out and deal with some of the technical issues to lay the foundations first. But it doesn't necessarily deal with those underlying political tensions. That hasn't been resolved. So there's reason for optimism with some of the lessons learned, but we're not there yet.
But in concrete terms, what did they actually achieve in terms of building foundations?
So in terms of building foundations, some of the most important components that they addressed, as I said, a program called REDD+, which is about reforestation and dealing with deforestation and reforestation. They came to some pretty concrete agreements on how that can deal with the problem of land use change and deforestation. They also came to some agreements on what the structure of a final deal would look like. The fact that it would have to include not only binding commitments of some kind or another, but also transparency and some mechanism for ensuring that other countries can trust the commitments that you're making and see that you're keeping up to them. Now, this has historically been a fairly tense issue. It was a very tense issue between US and China in Copenhagen. And so they've laid a bit more of the foundation to take out some of those technical points that previously were used as roadblocks for the underlying political issues. Now again, going into Durban this year, where the negotiations will be held in South Africa, there's going to be new political pressure, or the old political pressure is going to be back on these negotiations. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, Kyoto expires effectively at the end of this year, and whether there's going to be a second commitment period for Kyoto has always been an underlying question of these negotiations. Will it be hung on to and kept for the future, or will it be a whole new deal? And that starts to tie into the questions of the North-South divide again, because within Kyoto, the technical terms are Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries, but basically it means developed countries that should cut emissions first, and the other countries that are going to wait for the first countries to cut emissions. And if Kyoto goes by the wayside, then that could reopen that back to the question of are developed countries going to insist some emerging economies go at the same time? And that's back into all the politics. So there's a lot more tensions that are going to go into Durban and South Africa back on those political issues.
Do you have a sense yet of which way that's going to go? Are we going to renovate Kyoto, or are we going to abandon it and try something different?
There are more guesses than there are negotiators who will go to Durban on that one. There's not a clear sense at this point in time, partly because where some countries have made public statements on it. So for example, Japan has said it's against keeping Kyoto as for a second commitment period. Those may be movable negotiating positions depending on what they would get in exchange for it. But again, when you put 200 parties at the table, each with their own little pile of things that they want to get out of it, and you put them all in a room together, how that plays out, it's going to be a big challenge.
Do you need 200? Or could a subset of the world get together and decide we're going to do it this way, and because of our collective clout, everybody else will have to follow suit?
So that's actually a really important potential shift that could happen, not necessarily this year or just this year, but over the coming decade. In terms of getting a deal on carbon emissions, a lot of people have said, well, if you get China and US to agree to something, then that covers a huge fraction and people may fall in line. But that's only one way of trying to slice it up. And there's a lot of countries that would be very uncomfortable with that because of the perceived illegitimacy of not having other interests, for example, really developing countries, African nations at the table, island states at the table. But there's other ways to break up the negotiations so that you don't have to have all 200 people in the room all the time. As I mentioned before, underlying climate change are all of these related issues: how we use energy, how we grow our food, how we use our land. And it's tied into economic issues, trade issues, security issues. And we have other forums that are out there for discussing these. We have the World Trade Organization. We have the G20 for economic issues. We have the World Health Organization for dealing with various things. And there are, in each of those places, there are different constituencies represented that could, by talking about the issues, the climate issue as related to that particular sector, start to make more headway in defining agreements on subsets that lay the foundation for the future. One of the ways in which that could be most valuable is the fact that the negotiators that typically go to these negotiations, and even the ministers that typically go, are environment ministers and environmental negotiators, which frankly, when they sit at the cabinet tables back in their countries, are not sitting at the more prominent positions that industry and finance are sitting. And so if you really want to start making the substantive changes to our economic infrastructure that we're going to have to in order to really address our chronic addiction to carbon, then you need to find ways to get those ministers, those ministries engaged in the conversations. Now, one way to do it would be bring more people to the climate negotiations. That's probably not a very effective way of having those conversations. Another way, at least to start the conversations and launch them, is to have conversations in other fora that already exist. And there's some elements of that happening already. The World Trade Organization, for example, has started to hold meetings dedicated to what do we do about climate change? How does this impact trade barriers and tariffs and how we price carbon onto products across borders? It's a starting point. We need more of that.
Well, let's continue that conversation in just a minute. I'll be back with Jason Blackstock. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Let's talk a bit more about your last point, which was the possibility of attempting to solve the global climate change problem, not top-down from bottom-up. Obviously, we haven't made a lot of headway yet, treating it as a global problem requiring top-down global solution. Is there any possibility for bottom-up solution here, either technically or from a governance perspective?
I think there's tremendous potential for that, and it's part of the narrative that's been somewhat missed so far in the way climate change has been communicated. Climate change has been communicated largely as a doom and gloom scenario for the future that we have to avoid. It's a global problem with global threats, and all of that is quite right. The science shows all of that. It is not a wrong narrative from the sense of being technically or scientifically wrong. But when someone wakes up in the morning and hears about climate doom and gloom on the radio, for the most part, people seem to tune it out these days. There's lots of doom and gloom stories out there, and if it's a global problem requiring a global solution, well, that's for the government to take care of. They'll go to the negotiations and solve it. But the reality is, in order to address climate change as a global society, individuals around the world are going to have to change their behaviors. They're going to have to change the way they do business, change the way they use energy. Some of those changes are pretty significant over the long run, and we've got to figure out how that's going to happen. But it can start at the individual level.
As long as you make it pay for the individual, right?
As long as you make it pay, as long as it aligns with their incentives, as long as there's an incentive to make those changes. And that's where there's actually real opportunities, and a narrative of opportunity related to climate change could be incredibly valuable. There's a lot of places that are now starting to talk about investing in green jobs, growing the green economy, the low carbon future. We've seen even in the recovery packages from the financial crisis, there were several countries like Korea and even in the US that invested in the growth of green jobs. Now, so far that's been a only somewhat tangible concept. Where are those green jobs going to be? What do they look like? Are they actually going to help with unemployment problems? Are they going to help when the energy infrastructure is being changed over to renewables? Where is it going to come from? Action at the local level has started to provide those sorts of answers to those sorts of questions, have started to provide examples. Some places there are small examples, other places there are larger ones. In North America, we've seen states like California and provinces like British Columbia go ahead with beginning to put in place carbon taxes, and as a result, reinvest that money into the growth of different green economic sectors within those regions. They're going to potentially be ahead of the game as carbon prices start to become more required in the future. They're taking the opportunity, they're seizing the opportunity to get ahead by developing the infrastructure they're going to require, whether it's in terms of how they design their cities and their transportation and the sorts of new jobs that come from a different building paradigm than was used before, or a different urban growth paradigm, or whether it's simply through the development of new technologies, low energy technologies, energy efficiency technologies. the countries, the regions, the localities that get ahead on developing those are going to be in a fantastic position in a few years to be able to sell those technologies or sell those ideas or consult on those ideas to other places.
So a carbon tax is a way of the government forcing people to save money by reducing their carbon footprint. So it's not exactly a case of individuals out of the goodness of their heart seeking to make a statement about climate change.
It's a combination, and this is where in modern democracies it gets a little complicated, because if the people weren't willing to pay that price to make the change, they'd vote that government out. And actually, that's happened in some places. But by continuing to vote in progressive governments on climate, the people are basically, that's a bottom-up response saying, actually, we want this sort of change and we want those incentives. And yes, a carbon tax is in some ways a disincentive to get you off of carbon, but the way in which the governments use that money, for example, in British Columbia, they take that money and stick it back into a fund that flows into green technology development and green growth. It's creating a positive incentive for the growth of those opportunities at the same time. So it's not just the classic, we're going to tax you off of something. It's also encouraging that growth in other ways. So in this way, it's a hybrid of bottom-up and some top-down. It's not actually a purely bottom-up grassroots that we're used to from the human rights movement, for example, and it's not global top-down, certainly from we're going to put a global carbon price in place. It's a mixture. And by having in the places where there's that opportunistic framing of climate issues, of a green energy or low-carbon future, we're seeing a lot more response from the public, which is positively driven and not the knee-jerk reaction against carbon prices, but rather a focus on the benefits that will come from it.
And are you sensing any interest among the trade community, for example, the WTO or elsewhere, in actually talking about pricing carbon into global trade?
Well, it's funny, there are some places that's happening mostly at the national levels now, as opposed to in the international organizations. The WTO, for example, is more of a discussion about how would we deal or how should we deal with places that some have carbon taxes and carbon prices, others don't. How do you deal with that discrepancy because the people who are putting on carbon prices don't want to be disadvantaged in the international market or have their domestic industries be outsourced because of the price. But there are some innovative thinking going on in different countries around the world. China, for example, in looking around and thinking that, well, other countries are going to start putting a price on carbon, has now been talking about, well, we're going to put a border adjustment on carbon for all of our exports. So in other words, we're going to keep that money. We're just going to add the tax on this end so that it costs the same going out the door and doesn't hurt your market. But that allows them to reinvest in green energy development, green growth, low carbon growth in their own country. So there's innovative thinking that's been spurred by this. It's still at a nascent stage. It still is emerging, and these conversations need to go on and continue along.
And who is pushing these conversations? Are these academics? Are these scientists? Are these university-based economists, or are they coming from the public sector, the private sector?
The reality is it's a whole mishmash of places that the ideas have come from. In a lot of cases, surprisingly, it's not been the places that some people would originally think. For example, a lot of these ideas have not necessarily come from what is viewed as the green NGO community. To some extent, because the green NGO community has been talking a lot about the need to make the change and the threat and the challenges that will come from climate change. Whereas industry, to some extent, has been sitting back going, all right, what do? We make money. We make money based on any situation that's put in front of us, and the world's going to change, so we need to adapt to it. So industry, in some cases and in some countries, has been very proactive in saying, we want regulation, we want prices on carbon, because it sends us a signal. It tells us what we need to plan for the future. And we're good at making money no matter what the situation, so just tell us and we'll prepare for it.
It's a hopeful sign.
It's a hopeful sign. Leaves some challenges.
Right. We'll be back in a minute with Jason Blackstock. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us. Jason, let's talk about this research program here at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation that you've been involved in. What is CIGI trying to do, and how is CIGI trying to move global climate politics forward?
So we're in the stage of developing the program with all of its different elements. Some of the core, we had a big meeting here called CG10 Climate of Action back in the fall of 2010. And there we talked about a lot of the same issues that we've just gone over, the negotiations and how you think about them differently, went over the north-south politics and how you think about that, and questions about what a green economy looks like in the future. Those are going to be some foundational pillars going forward. How do we restructure global climate negotiations or global climate governance in general in terms of getting other institutions or other negotiating bodies involved? How do you define the differences between green economy in a developed country versus a developing or an emerging country? A green economy or a low carbon economy could look very different in those countries. And so mapping out what that looks like technically and what from the point of view of energy resources, from the point of view of transportation systems, as well as what it means politically and how you begin laying the foundations. That's going to be a core part of it. The bit that we haven't talked about so much today so far is what you do if Tad Homer Dixon in some of the negative forecasts that he made, some of the potential for real negative futures, turns out to be correct in some of the things that we're going to be up against. How do you begin responding if the climate system changes faster than we've hoped it would change? And part of the research program here focuses particularly on that, and this is one of the parts that I lead most prominently, which is on geoengineering technologies. These are very radical concepts for intentionally intervening in the climate system in order to try and ameliorate or lessen the dangers that come from climate change. But there's a lot of both technical questions that are unanswered about what geoengineering would do or how we would use it, and what the politics of geoengineering will be. How are they going to play into the sort of negotiating problems we've already had? You were just adding another issue to the negotiating challenges.
Now, you and I have talked about this before, and as I recall, you were saying that geoengineering is actually not all that difficult in principle. In fact, you could probably do it fairly cheaply. In fact, almost any country could probably, on their own accord, decide to engage in geoengineering if they really wanted to.
That's entirely correct. Some of the politics are there. Now let me just clarify just quickly. Geoengineering is actually a big broad category of stuff that people have lumped a lot of things that they don't like in terms of technologies into. But really there are two broad kinds. There's what's called carbon geoengineering, which is the idea that we're going to try and take the carbon out of the atmosphere that we put up there in the first place. That sounds in principle pretty good, and there's not a lot of risks associated with that, but it's expensive, it's long-term, it's not going to have an immediate impact, and there's a lot of technical challenges to be sorted out. Something that we should be looking into. It's kind of like carbon capture and storage, kind of like grabbing CO2 out of the tailpipe, but instead letting it go from the tail, after it's out of the tailpipe, grabbing it back. Right. Great idea. Expensive. Hard to do. On the other hand, there's solar geoengineering, and this is the stuff that's fast, cheap, and very uncertain. What do I mean by that? Well, solar radiation that's coming in from the sun is what drives our climate system. It's what heats our planet up and keeps it at a good temperature until we start trapping too much heat. But if we were to just reflect a little bit of sunlight away from the planet to keep it from being absorbed, to try and counteract the effect of CO2 trapping more heat within the atmosphere, in principle, we could start to counterbalance some of the global warming that we've seen. Now, we actually have a natural analog for this. When a volcano, not Eyjafjallajökull that went off last year, that wasn't a powerful enough one, but the one that went off back in 1991-92, Mount Pinatubo, was powerful enough to stick a whole bunch of particles up into the stratosphere. That's the bit above the clouds. Basically, it went up above the clouds and stayed up there for about a year and fell out gradually. By providing basically a sunshade, a parasol, that reflected just a little bit of sunlight away, kind of like the haze that we've seen in a lot of cities. It just keeps a little bit of the sun reflected back into the atmosphere, back away from the atmosphere. It cooled the climate of the planet by 0.5 degrees Celsius in 1992. Pretty significant.
I remember that well.
Exactly.
Beautiful sunsets too.
Very beautiful sunsets. But the whole point is, it was fast. It went off in late 1991, and 1992 was half a degree centigrade cooler. So in principle, if we were to artificially inject things into the stratosphere, we might be able to get exactly that same result. Now,
But we'd have to keep doing it.
But we'd have to keep doing it, and we'd have to keep doing it for very long periods in time. And so this raises a whole bunch of political questions about who gets to decide when we're going to do that. Now, you raised the question, you raised the point that it could be done by an individual nation. Now, why do we think that? We know that effectively because all it really takes is a fleet of somewhere around 20 to 30 aircraft, pretty conventional aircraft with a little bit of modification, flying up there with a little hose spraying some stuff up there. There's a lot of technical questions to be sorted out about what size particles and where exactly to disperse them, but those are pretty small questions by comparison to what we already know. And the cost of that could be around just flying that sort of a fleet. This is sort of like a very small airline in America or in Europe. Costs of around $1 billion a year are very plausible. And that's something that's within the range, having airplanes and $1 billion a year is within range, maybe not of every country in the world, but certainly quite a few of them.
What about the moral hazard, right? If we go this route, doesn't it take the pressure off of getting off the carbon economy?
So this goes to the last point, which is the uncertain point. Fast, cheap,
And out of
uncertain. Well, the question is it out of control or not? And we don't have a lot of very detailed scientific understanding of that yet, mostly because people were so concerned about the moral hazard issue that you raised, that it would just encourage people to forget about climate change and move on, that solar geoengineering was off the table for discussion for a long time. And only recently, when scientists in particular started to look at how badly we've done on getting a global climate deal, that they started to say, you know what, we might need a plan B, we'd better start looking at this. And as a result, it's led to the point in time, to the current stage, where scientific research is emerging. We don't have a lot of information yet, but as scientific research emerges, there's a big question about how we're going to govern the research itself. Who's going to have access to the knowledge? Who's going to make decisions about time to move to the next stage of research, to start doing maybe little bits of field tests in the atmosphere? And then how this all will end up relating back to the global climate politics, to our understanding of the climate system itself. All of those are very important and uncertain, very uncertain issues at the minute. Research group here spends a lot of time, the 6 to 10 people we've now got working on this, taking the political issues, the technical issues into account, mapping them out better, and starting to think about how we integrate all of this together into a holistic view of the climate problem.
It's hard to imagine a more important task, and of course I wish you all the best as you do this. Thank you very much for coming in today and sharing your experience and your insights with us.
Thank you very much, David.
And, to the audience, please join us again next week with another edition of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.